Thank you, Ambassador, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests. I'm going to open my remarks on my report for about 10 minutes and reserve the last 2 minutes of my opening remarks on my country visit report to Venezuela. This report is on the right to food, finance, and national action plans. Of all my reports I've written so far, this is the most practical-oriented and answers the question, how can countries use the right to food to transform their national food system? Let me begin with what's at stake. You will all recall when the COVID pandemic struck in 2020, it immediately triggered a food crisis. And there's no obvious reason why a virus and a pandemic would trigger a food crisis. What that finally confirmed, what many of us knew for decades, is that most food systems do not serve the people. Most food systems produce violence. Most food systems violate people's human rights and serve the interests of corporations, financiers, and the wealthy. That's what we learned in the COVID pandemic, if you didn't already know that. And I've written several reports I wrote several reports on how to respond to that food crisis. The dark irony is that when the pandemic ended, the food crisis got worse. For some reason, governments did not learn the correct lessons. During COVID, governments implemented temporary measures that to some degree alleviated the hunger crisis. We knew what to do: give people direct cash payments, support territorial markets and local producers, focus on women and other people in communities that are involved in taking care of families and their community. But instead of turning those programs into permanent policies, governments ended those programs, which made the food crisis worse. Now we are several years past the pandemic, but we see the rates of hunger increase. We see the situation because of climate change getting worse. And unfortunately, what I'm also seeing is the rate of violence, starvation, and famine increasing. So we have to ask ourselves, why are countries vulnerable to starvation and famine in the first place? It's because their food systems are not designed to serve the people. Every major powerful country, every permanent voting member on the Security Council, either directly or indirectly, supports starvation as a weapon. If you do not change your food system today, and I'm speaking primarily to small countries, island countries, developing countries, I'm speaking to the majority countries of the world. If you do not change your food system today, you are increasing your risk and you are exposing yourselves to risk of starvation and famine and hunger. We are going to see food used as a weapon of war more and more going forward. In Palestine, it is the fastest starvation campaign in modern history. In Sudan, it is the largest number of people facing starvation and famine in modern history. It's again because their food systems have been designed poorly. Hunger is not caused by natural causes. For the last 100 years, we know for a fact that hunger is always the result of political failure, of institutional shortcomings. With this report, I provide you a concrete way forward, what to do, how to transform your food system in light of existing realities. And one of those existing realities is the debt crisis. Many countries had to borrow money to deal with COVID. This was, of course, coming out of the 2008 financial crisis. According to an UNCTAD report from June, global debt rates reached a historic peak of $97 trillion in 2023. This was an increase by $5.6 trillion from the previous year. To make loan payments, many governments have had to dramatically cut down on public spending, including on critical social services that are vital to ensure access to adequate food for the poorest and most affected segments of society, such as older women and single mothers. Countries are facing a terrible choice. Either they service their debt and people will get more hungry and poor, or countries attend to their people's social needs, to their hunger and poverty, and risk financial instability. In fact, many food systems themselves, as they exist today, contribute to sovereign debt, and they put farmers and food producers into debt. The main reason is that food systems are being dominated by corporations and governed by international financial institutions. Human rights is not playing a central role. So first, economies are increasingly dependent on the United States dollar. The dominance of the US dollar makes trade-dependent nations vulnerable to the political economy of the US. I do not need to say more why this is becoming more and more problematic by the day. The result is that for over decades, many developing countries have designed food systems specialized in cash crops. They are producing edible commodities, not food, and they produce them for the purpose of export in order to draw in foreign currency, especially US dollars. This is often at the expense of diverse food crops traditionally consumed by local populations. Governments have also disinvested from agriculture and social spending, leaving food system investment to corporations and financial institutions, meaning corporations and financial institutions extract wealth from the food system, leaving people poor and more hungry. And third, we are stuck in periods of price volatility and crisis, so-called boom and bust cycles. And when food prices rise, multinational corporations benefit. For example, between 2020 and 2022, again, this is the COVID pandemic, fertilizer and grain trading corporations profited immensely, with fertilizer companies' profit margins quadrupling at the expense of farmers and governments in the global south. These companies made money off of people's misery. And fourth, climate change increases the borrowing costs for low-income countries. Financial institutions and private lenders penalize climate-vulnerable nations with higher interest rates, leading to higher debt. More debt limits your ability to tackle climate change and structural inequality. So what is to be done? In this report, I focus on the progressive realization on the right to food. Many of you here know that sometimes the concept of progressive realization on human rights is used with a dark irony, which is it's used for governments to argue why they're not going to do anything. I'm presenting the progressive realization on the right to food in a way to look at your existing spending as an opportunity to transform your food system, so that you don't have to borrow significant amounts of money and go into more debt. Rather, what I present is a plan on how to first determine how much are you already spending on your food system. There's no clear methodology on how to do that. I provide a methodology on how to assess how much you're already spending on your food system from a right to food perspective. Then I provide a guide on how to transform your existing budget. And with that, you can radically change how your food system operates. Let me provide you with some context. First, on April 5th this year, April 5th in Rome, the UN Committee on World Food Security will be hosting a collaborative governance dialogue, and the subject will be financing for food security and nutrition. This is an important opportunity for countries, international organizations, and civil society to come together and discuss all the different options and risks and potential avenues of what to do on the issue of finance and food security and nutrition. I encourage all of you to send your representatives from your Rome-based missions and to come in with a right to food perspective and plan, or at least questions on how to use the right to food to finance food system transformation. Many of us have our eye on the conference on June 30th to the 3rd of July in Sevilla, Spain. This is the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development. It is important to put food systems on the agenda, and it is important to put the right to food specifically on that agenda. And again, I encourage you all to do so. And then there will also be the Food System Summit +4. So the Food System Summit was held in 2021 in Addis Ababa on July 28th to the 29th, 2025. There will be a focus on financing. What I encourage all of you to do in all these forums is to make sure the debt crisis is on the agenda during conversations about financing. In my conversations with the World Bank and other international financial organizations and UN organizations, they're reluctant to talk about debt. They just want to go straight to financing because they want to put you into more debt, which makes you weak and vulnerable. Make sure at every opportunity where there are discussions about financing, you put debt on the agenda. And make sure you bring in plans and demands for a human rights approach to debt and financing. In my remaining minute with my opening statement, I'll now turn to Venezuela and my country visit. I was incredibly impressed by the peoples in Venezuela. I met many communities, indigenous communities, communities in the city and rural communities. Venezuela also has a very strong constitution and has a tradition of social movement and social consultation, which up until recently has given Venezuela some very innovative programs based on the right to food and food sovereignty. However, what I did see was the space for civil society shrinking quickly. And this goes against the spirit of the Venezuelan constitution itself. And I hope Venezuela maintains that space for civil society because of civil society and because of the strong constitution, Venezuela has one of the most dynamic and strong laws about seeds. And I highlighted this as an example for other countries to follow. But that was during a time when Venezuela made a huge amount of space for civil society and participation. And so again, I reiterate and encourage Venezuela to broaden and open up that space for civil society. Thank you, Excellencies and distinguished guests. I look forward to our dialogue.